Okay. So before we get today's session underway, I just wanted to say a few words of welcome and to put this event in context. Now, as you probably know, 8th of March is International Women's Day, and thousands of events are held throughout the world, and particularly in Wales, to inspire women and to celebrate their achievements. Now, that date has been observed since the early 1900s, and of course 1900s was a time of great expansion and turbulence in the industrial world, and that saw booming of population in cities and of course a rise in radical ideologies. And March the 8th is the day that we should take time to reflect on the sacrifices made by women worldwide who brought about positive changes for us, and their whole range of women, I'm sure you all know, and in this part of the world, of course, the suffragettes and what they did to ensure that we could have the vote. I just wonder whether I would have had that kind of courage, and I'm quite sure I wouldn't have. But I'm quite convinced that one day a year is not enough, you know, for us to celebrate what women do and reflect on how far we've got and how we need to move forward. So during my term as presiding officer, one of the themes I am concentrating on is equality, and this year I'm concentrating on women and the opportunities for women. And today's seminar will explore the barriers to women's participation and representation. So I'm holding a series of similar regional events across Wales over the coming months, which will culminate in a national conference in Cardiff in November. So what we, decide today, or may not decide anything, but impressions we're getting from today will be carried forward to that conference, and I hope that you will all be able to attend that conference in November. I'm sure that what we need to do today is to decide whether we are doing what we should be doing, whether we're doing enough, whether we're doing too much indeed, and so that you'll task me and my fellow Assembly members and women like yourselves in positions of influence to ensure that any barriers to future participation are removed. Now, I'm very pleased that we have Joyce Watson here today. Joyce is the Assembly member for the whole of Wales, it appears, but I don't think it's quite that, but it's a very big region. We have apologies from Angela Burns, who was due to come this afternoon, but she's been detained. In fact, she's got a problem with a knee, and we've all been telling her to get it sorted out, and today she's hopefully going to get it sorted out. We also have apologies from Rebecca Evans, another Assembly member who represents the region. So we've got 3 very strong women. You've also got 2 men who are also very strong, Simon Thomas and William Powell. So they've sent their apologies today. No, Paul Davis, I beg your pardon, Paul Davis. Send their apologies for today, but they wish us well with this conference. Now, the Assembly has a legal duty under the Government of Wales Act to promote equality, and I'm personally very pleased that this duty has been taken extremely seriously since the Assembly came into being in 1999. Delivering equality has become part of our custom and practice. And importantly, some of you will have heard me say this before, we don't do it because we have to. We do it because we want to, and we do it because it's the right thing to do. And that's the important thing. Equality shouldn't be an added on, bolted on anywhere. It should be at the core and the centre of everything we do. Now, a few weeks ago, I had the privilege of addressing a group of women from Libya and Jordan who had come to learn about what we do and how we do it. And it was a stark reminder of the continuing struggle to get women's voices heard in some parts of the world. Now, I'm absolutely delighted that Sue Balsam, who is a long-standing friend of mine, she's managing director of Francis Balsam Associates, has agreed to chair today's session. Now, she will introduce our panel, and they're a panel who I think are women who continue to push at artificial barriers that are put in the way of women in Wales today. I've met them for the first time today. I spent some time with Holly, and I am very impressed, that these young women, I'm continually impressed by my own daughters because they don't put up with the rubbish I used to put up with. And I'm very pleased that Holly, is a young woman in the forefront of media across Wales. And I'm delighted that Bronwyn and Melinda are here, and I look forward to talking to you more later on. So I'll hand over to Sue. I hope you enjoy the afternoon, and please do take part. Don't sit there and think this is for somebody else. So, diolch yn fawr.
Can I begin not only by thanking you for this initiative, but also paying tribute to Rosemary for her commitment over the years in terms of women's role, and in particular the way she's always promoted International Women's Day in Wales for many, many years. She herself is very much a role model, having multitasked in public life as a counsellor and mum and lots of other things, moving on to being AM, and now in this very prestigious role as presiding officer and being able to really lead from the front in terms of the women's agenda. So it's really great that you've done this, so thank you very much, Rosemary. My pleasure is to introduce the three, I was about to say contestants.
It's been election time.
Panel members, no pressure. I'm intrigued to find out that there's a bit of a thread running through the three panel members. Melinda, who is Pembrokeshire born but now the Vale of Glamorgan, spent most of her life in court. But also works for organisations such as Fairlake, which deliver housing support, and she's a member of the Pembrokeshire National Park, so she's got some experience there. The legal theme continues with Holly, who's a law graduate, but who has led NewsQuest here in Pembrokeshire for a number of years, having started as a journalist and now as an editor. So not only are you in that role yourself, but presumably meet a lot of women in different ways and can talk about that, hopefully. And Bronwyn has the distinction of being one of the few female chief executives in local government in Ceredigion, where actually we have at the moment a female leader and chair. So we're not really quite in the backwoods in Ceredigion, we're possibly in the van even. But we look forward to hearing from Bronwyn as well. So if I can first of all invite Melinda to have a few words about the sort of experiences she's had and thoughts about women's role, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you. Rosemary, Sue, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your warm welcome and kind invitation to be with you here today. I'm sure there are others with a far more prominent role in public life than I, better equipped to speak to you today. Nevertheless, I'm delighted to be here with you to share my experience of my role, and I hope that I persuade you that women can make both a valuable contribution and a real difference, whatever their role in public life. It is certainly important that women do play a role in public life and the way in which our public services and affairs in Wales are monitored and delivered. Public life embraces a number of areas, as you might well know, such as community and council roles, leaders of public services, representation on company boards, to public appointments. And the routes to each role can vary through a local body, via a more progressive approach, perhaps that is via a local body to a public appointment, or direct through public appointment. And I chose the latter route, an application for a public role as Welsh Government appointed member of the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park Authority. As a recently retired civil servant, I say retired like that because I'm not quite ready yet to admit to drawing my pension, the transition to a public appointment role was a fairly easy one for me and overall a very positive experience. However, that doesn't mean there weren't any obstacles that I had to overcome, one a self-imposed barrier. And I'm sure it wouldn't be of any surprise to you to learn that it was a similar obstacle that I faced during my civil service career. As Sue mentioned, I was born and raised in Pembrokeshire, a few miles north of Haverfordwest, before moving away at the age of 21 to take up a post in the then Lord Chancellor's department. The focus of my job graduated towards estates, looking after part of the court service estate in Wales, and then onto project management, in a role as part of a headquarters team in London. I worked in a male-dominated construction environment. Most of my colleagues and senior managers were male, as were the professionals I engaged, architects, engineers, accountants, and the like. I should say I have nothing at all against working with men. I enjoyed their company and working with them very much indeed, and still do today. And I mentioned that one of the barriers I faced was self-imposed, really of my own making, and that was quite simply from time to time a lack of self-confidence. The latest role I held in Her Majesty's Court Service was to manage a portfolio of construction projects to deliver from initiation to completion a fully functioning new court building. And I knew what qualities as a woman I could bring to that post. A close and clear understanding of what people, my customers, wanted, a supportive and collaborative approach with my colleagues and the consultant teams I led, a real focus on what I wanted to deliver and what I wanted to achieve, and a belief that I could make a real difference. However, particularly in the early days, I often came away from meetings thinking that colleagues possessed far greater self-confidence than I and appeared to be far more knowledgeable. And this did lead me on one occasion to raise this with my manager, and the reply came, "Melinda, you're doing fine. You know as much, if not more than your colleagues. You do not go looking for problems that aren't there. From my perspective, you're low maintenance." I'm not sure my husband would agree with that latter comment. But looking back, I think it was a compliment, and it certainly gave me the assurance I sought. And I took it that he, my manager, meant I got on with my work, didn't look for problems, but dealt with problems that arose when they arose, and organised and prioritised my work well, something that women, as householders, mothers, carers, and in their career, do every day of their life, all skills that are relevant to roles in public life. From some background reading that I've undertaken around the subject of today's seminar and similar events elsewhere, a common barrier seems to be that women are naturally modest. They undervalue their achievements and overestimate what is required of them in a public role. You may all be far more confident and assertive than I, but I would still encourage those here today not already involved to seriously consider taking up a public appointment. I absolutely thoroughly enjoy my role as a member of Pembrokeshire Coast National Park Authority, and although I'm still fairly new to that role, I find it really most rewarding. When I left the civil service under an early release scheme in 2010, and after over 26 years' service, I wanted to try and make use of some of the skills and experience I had gained in public life. But the question was, how? How do I do this? Where? In what role? What would suit me in terms of the time I had available and the level of skills that I had? And how did I go about finding out more information and applying? To overcome these barriers, I carried out some research on the web and came across the public appointment page on the Welsh Government website. And I have to say, it was a really excellent part of the website. It explained a little more about what a public appointment was about, the range of public services at local and national level covered by committees of which public appointees are members. And this included such a wide range of areas: sports, schools, health, museums. It also covered the application process and set out the current vacancies. And I also noted that the Public Appointments Unit ran a 2-day free training course. I decided to take up that opportunity, and I attended the training course in Cardiff, and it was great. I have to say, it taught me a lot about the application and interview process, and I found it very helpful. It was also a great confidence booster, referring to my earlier barrier. If you're interested in applying for an appointment, you can register your details with the unit, together with the areas in which you have particular skills or interests, and they will email you a copy of advertisements for all the relevant current vacancies as and when they arrive. A year after attending the course and having in the meantime taking up a post as a non-executive board member of Fairlake, a company in the Seren Group, I received a copy of the advert for Pembrokeshire Coast National Park Authority. I had in the meantime received notices of a number of other public appointment vacancies, but they didn't seem quite right for me. However, as soon as I looked at this one, I decided immediately to apply. I still maintained strong links with and a love for Pembrokeshire and had some of the knowledge and skills that they were seeking. Quite often the committee is not looking for someone who is an expert upon everything in their service area, but perhaps requires someone to supplement or complement the existing skills and knowledge of the committee as a whole, or to bridge a particular gap. When you apply for a public appointment, I think it is important to remember to play to your strengths and recognise that we can't all be experts in everything. Take care to address the precise requirements of the position and the criteria set out in the application. Use examples of your experience and your achievements, and remember that the CV you may have relied upon before might not work in this particular scenario. I was fortunate to be successful in my application and interview, and the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park Authority comprises 12 nominated councillors from Pembrokeshire County Council and 6 appointees by Welsh Government, and I am pleased to say that of the 6 Welsh Government appointees, 3 of us are women, and I'm delighted that one of my colleagues, Gwyneth, is here with us today. For anyone thinking of starting out on this path, I think it would be helpful to think about friends, friends of friends, or acquaintances you may know who have a role in public life. Perhaps there is someone who inspires you or works in an area in which you have an interest. I am sure that they would not mind being approached for information about what their role involves or how they became involved, even if it means referring you to someone else who can assist. Perhaps they can even offer shadowing or mentoring opportunities to assist in gaining knowledge about what is involved. It is always worth asking. To be most responsive and effective, a decision-making body has to be diverse, and this is, I believe, where women have so much to offer. They bring a different perspective, sometimes different values, and they bring different life experiences. Women's participation means that a greater part of the population is represented, making that decision-making body feel more legitimate and bringing different issues to the table. In public life, I've also learned that whilst there are occasions when it is appropriate to focus on the detail, never lose sight of the bigger picture. Think strategically. Look at the detail, but remember where you are going and what you are trying to achieve. Women are so good at doing this, doing more than one thing at the same time successfully. You may have heard the line, Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in high heels. I have listened with great interest to the opening remarks today and also will listen with interest to what my fellow panellists will share with us. I'm also keen to hear from you during the question and answer session. The rewards of a role in public life, certainly in my mind, far outweigh the barriers. I began by saying how important the participation of women is in public life, and I can only re-emphasize that now. Women can have a significant impact, and you can make a real difference. We all have a responsibility to make sure this continues and is extended. Here's to high heels, and may there be more of them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Melinda. That was a great, passionate appeal and lots of advocacy, but also touching on the question of whether or not we are limiting ourselves sometimes in terms of our aspirations, and I'm sure that will be something that will be picked up in discussion. I'm going to turn to Holly now to ask her to tell us her story, as it were.
Okay. I mean, perhaps I ought to just start with the fact that it's not really until this week that I even considered the issue that I am female and a woman and an editor very much. I'm lucky enough to work in an industry where there have always been female role models. They may not be that many of them, but they've always been there. Indeed, I was very surprised to learn when I was sort of researching this to find out that the first editor of a national newspaper was actually imposed in the 1890s. She was Rachel Beer. She was editor of The Observer and The Sunday Times. Now, albeit her husband was very rich and actually owned the 2 titles, so that helped, no doubt. Sadly, the roles were taken off her in 1903 when she essentially had what we'd probably now say was a nervous breakdown. She had some meetings with doctors and somebody called a barrister of lunacy. And sadly, they took everything off of her. But she was there. She was the main pioneer. It wasn't for another 80 years, really, that female editors on national newspapers came about again. But there have been names that you will know: Eve Pollard, Rosie Boycott, Rebecca Brooks, Amanda Platel. Rebecca Brooks obviously went on to become chief executive of News International. Sly Bailey has been chief executive of Trinity Mirror, the regional arm of the Mirror Group. So there have always been women there that that you can look to and think, well, it never even occurred to me when I went into journalism that I couldn't be an editor. It was just always that I assumed if I was going to be a journalist, one day I would want to run a newspaper. I mean, it's true, I started as a junior reporter on my local newspaper. I went on work experience, went in there. There have always been, every newspaper I've worked on has had a woman in one of the top 3 editorial positions in that newspaper. I've worked on 4 large newspapers. I've had to move around the country, or 4 main sort of newspaper titles or series. Of those, all of those papers were over 150 years old, but actually of those, only 3 of them had female editors. And that was all within sort of from the 90s, I believe, early 90s, that came in. So if you think, you know, yes, women are there and they have been, but clearly there must have been some barriers, you know, along the way. I've edited 2 newspapers. Both those newspapers, I'm actually the 2nd female editor of those papers, and I've succeeded, you know, I've followed a female editor, which in some ways they've broken down a lot of the barriers perhaps for me. So it has never been an issue that maybe people are used to dealing with a woman, and they continue doing that. In fact, I've had more issues with my age rather than the fact that I'm female. I became an editor at 28. Now, being young and female didn't go down well with some elderly, particularly elderly men that I was dealing with. But it never was much of an issue. You just got a few comments, or the first time they meet you, or they'd say, oh, I came and handed in a press release to a really nice young girl, when they're talking to you on the phone, and you're thinking, yeah, that was me, you know, that kind of stuff. But it's never particularly been an issue, as I say. Every job that I've gone for that I've wanted, I've either got, or the one time there was a job that I really wanted that I didn't get, actually went to a woman, but she had 15 years more experience than me, so I can't argue against that. So, as I say, in newspapers, key roles, news editors, deputy editors. In fact, my news editor, in some ways, news editors are one of the most powerful jobs in the newsroom. A lot of newspapers, maybe their editor's not male, but the news editor, who's really the one that controls pretty much everything that goes day to day into the newspaper. Very many of those roles are taken by women. You get quite a few women in the production editor type role, who are the ones who are putting the pages together of the newspapers. You know, my group, NewsQuest, in NewsQuest Wales, the key powerful position on a whole, making sure a whole series of newspapers can come out, is a woman. So it's interesting. Apparently, according to some figures I found this week, the NUJ have said that in newspapers, about 60% of journalists are men, 40% are women. In the national newspapers, you're looking at about 25% women, so it falls a bit. Regional newspapers, I couldn't actually find any figures anywhere. So without actually going through each paper individually, you know, I couldn't do that. But I can give you an example of the situation here in Wales, and I believe Wales is further forward compared to many areas I've worked in, just on the evidence that I found this week. In Pembrokeshire, there are 3 main newspaper series, or 3 key newspaper groups that work in Pembrokeshire, 3 editor roles. Of those 3, 2 of them are women, one of them obviously being myself. Extend that out to South Wales. Last year we formed a South West Wales editors group, just because we thought it'd be useful, you know, talking to organisations. We all deal with the police, health trusts, that kind of thing. Of that group, there are in the immediate area 8 editors, so extending out to Swansea, into Carmarthenshire and Ceredigion. Of those 8 editors, 4 of them are women, so that's a 50% ratio. So that's, you know, that's quite impressive, and actually higher than I was expecting it to be when I was looking into it. Having said that the women do get into the main editor roles, I then began looking at NewsQuest, our group, and we have 13 daily titles, and in the period of the 14 years, okay, I've been in newspapers, of the 13 daily titles, actually only ever 1 or 2 have been female editors at the same time. But as I've said, lots of the deputy editors and the other key roles will have been women. And the weeklies, you get a lot more female editors on the weekly newspapers. I don't have any particular figures. There are 9 key men currently on the main sort of board for NewsQuest, which covers 200 newspapers across the UK and other sort of publishing arms and print centres. Of those 9 people on that board, they are all men. We did have a female representative who was our editorial director. She was there for 10 years, but she retired last year. That was a role that actually wasn't replaced, and lots of editors have moved in to replace that into a committee. So yes, there are key roles. It would perhaps be nice to have a, you know, more, well, say a woman, it would be nice to have 1 woman, but more women on that role. But perhaps from my point of view, I'd like more editorial people on that board rather than they're predominantly from a commercial sort of background from our business. So there are other issues, but as I say, it's never held me back. It's never been something that I've particularly had to think about. Indeed, I was trying to think about, well, what have been the really bad things? Now, maybe I just shrug it off and don't notice because it's not an issue for me, so why is it an issue for anybody else? The few examples of things that I could find that have sort of irked a bit over the year. I've said about the particular type of elderly gentleman that you might come across, but it doesn't really become an issue down the line. It still annoys me occasionally to get letters to the editor, dear sir, but then I don't like dear madam either, so, you know, I don't mind that so much. And there's only been one occasion where, okay, I get called love and things a lot, but somebody called me Petal once, and that really annoyed me. That was sort of, I don't know why. I'm thinking my name's Holly. I'm a bit spiky, surely. You know, Petal was not the one. But that's actually, you know, in 14 years, that's been the worst thing. That was an advertising manager that I was working with. And that really did irk me, so much so that my editor at that time said, do you want me to go and have a word with him? And I was thinking that was a bit pathetic, just over a word, you know, calling somebody Petal. But it was, you know, they were kind of the worst things I could think of. Now, there are areas of journalism where it is a problem if you're a female, in particularly sports journalism. Journalism is very, very difficult. On the Nationals, only 3% of sports journalists are women. They particularly get lots of abuse, lots of problems dealing with locker rooms, covering matches. But then I've known junior male reporters who have gone in local football to go and cover a manager and had to deal with a manager stood there full frontal naked in front of them for an interview, and that's male reporters. So everybody in journalism have these issues. And occasionally there's sort of things, you know, if you go into the mosque or whatever, you know, women aren't allowed in certain parts of buildings and things. And that's just something that you think about. I once sent a female chief photographer to go and cover an event. It just hadn't occurred to me. It wasn't something that I'd thought about. Now, that's more my ignorance than anything else. But there are ways around it. And as long as you're speaking to people and dealing with people, you can, and sort of thinking, well, maybe we need to take pictures outside rather than inside or whatever. There's ways of thinking of things. But to say, it hasn't really been anything that's particularly worried me. Yes, it would be nice to have more women on editorships of dailies, but the key issues that we get with my stuff, I was talking to my reporters, just saying, you know, has it ever been a problem for you? What do you think? The main issue is rate of pay. Now, the men get paid really badly and the women get paid really badly in local journalism. You can earn more in PR. You've got more flexible hours in PR. So very often we end up training female journalists, women, they decide maybe they do want a family, so they leave and perhaps come back into PR and part-time. It's very difficult. I can't do my job part-time. It's very unpredictable hours. I am working weekends. I am working evenings. And if you've got a family, it can be very, very difficult to juggle that role, unless you're lucky enough to be, you know, in a position or on a smaller local paper that perhaps you own or you have some control over. I've had to move around the country a lot. I started in Wiltshire, went down to Dorset, I was in Buckinghamshire, now I'm in Pembrokeshire. I've had to do that to progress my career. You know, you look at head teacher roles, you think of how many schools there are in counties, 50, 60, 70 schools in a county, so you've got potential you could, you know, even if you're looking at 50%, you've got 40 roles. Editorship roles, as I've said, Pembrokeshire, there's only 3 editors covering the whole of Pembrokeshire. One of those actually has papers in Ceredigion as well. So actually there's only 2 of us whose newspapers are solely based in Pembrokeshire. So the jobs don't come up. Am I likely to progress any further in my career? I could go on a bigger newspaper, but quite frankly, I have a whole series of newspapers here, lots of websites. The job's no real difference. I get a really good quality of life being in Pembrokeshire. So it's the juggling. When I was in High Wycombe, I had no life at all. I was sleeping at home and that was about it. The rest of the time was spent in the office. Here I do have more space. When I am off duty, I know my team. If something breaks, which very rarely does in Pembrokeshire, but if something does break, for example, the Chevron explosion, you know, my team can get onto it very, very quickly. And obviously technology is something that helps with that. Twitter, Facebook, computers. You know, my guys were dealing with that until 11 o'clock at night, and then when I logged on at 5 o'clock the next morning thinking, oh, maybe I'll find out if there's an update, my team had already got there before me. So there are ways round, but it's very difficult. You know, if you want the next roles up are either, as I say, editors of larger papers or publishers or managing directors, all they do is spend their whole day with their head in spreadsheets. That's not me. I love newspapers, I love news, I love people, I love the life. I love creating a newspaper. You start at the beginning of the week with complete blank pages. I'm designing the front page on Tuesday morning, and it suddenly has character, a feeling, a life. To me, it's a living thing. I would completely lose that if I was just buried in figures all the time. So it's not so much that that there's any barrier preventing me from going any further in my career or career with NewsQuest. It's perhaps that I don't want to do that. If I wanted to become a publisher, I could do it. I would just have to move around and change my priorities, and that's not something I want to do. Who knows, maybe I'll get fed up 10 years down the line of being given budgets and told that, and want a bit more control over that. But then you've always got a boss somewhere up the chain that, I'm never going to be chief executive of NewsQuest, so...
Why not?
Well, yeah. It's partly I don't want to, because it would take over my whole life. I'd have to spend half my time on a plane to America, over to Gannett, who are our shareholders, So it's not something that I want to do. But if I did want to do it, I have absolutely no doubt that it would be possible.
Oh, thank you. Well, that was really interesting. And leaving aside Rebecca Brooks, who may not be the best role model right at this moment, although I do notice the front page of Bywyd this week is pursuing her in terms of the Salem witch hunt. So we might have mixed feelings about how she's being treated as a woman, although, of course, the other issues that she's involved in may be less savoury. But thank you for that, Holly, because you actually touched on quite a number of points there. In particular, I picked out that you made the point about your organisation, that when you get to the board level, that obviously there are far fewer women involved in that, and that's something perhaps we might look at later. Also, the cultural dimension, interestingly, you talked about the photographer going to the mosque. Clearly, there are constraints sometimes that perhaps we don't think about, and obviously the whole question then of other cultures and the role of women is a far bigger question. You touched on low pay. I suspect a lot of people have views about women and their levels of pay in organisations, and you also touched on the issue of ambition and conflicts of family or lifestyle interests, or commitments. So again, probably come back to those. But meanwhile, if I can turn to Bronwen, who's going to tell us about how she got to where she did, or has done.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks for the invitation. If I'm too loud, I actually never check the microphone. The problem as a rule is that I'm far, far too loud, and according to my husband, everybody can hear me and recognise my witch-like voice everywhere. So if it's uncomfortable, put your hand up. The other thing is you will need your headsets before the ends. I really want to thank you for the invitation. It is a privilege to be here. It's also a privilege to have listened to both Melinda and Holly. And because I have listened quite attentively, I think I will actually change what I intended saying in many ways. Because you don't want repeat performance. Both have picked up some issues I would have referred to. But yet, as one asks oneself, has there been any hurdles in local government to be promoted? And I would have to be honest and say no. When I have actually applied for a promotion, all save for one, I was promoted. And on that occasion, similar to you, Holly, the successful applicant was another female who happened to be in school with me and happened to be in the same university as me. And I'm not going to rubbish Tregaron School nor Aberystwyth University. So that was reality. And then I started thinking, when is the die cast? And this is where I've actually changed a bit of what I wanted to say. If you were to ask the academics and things that are out there, I may not have been the typical person to be a chief executive. Why do I say that? Well, let's start because I honestly believe, rightly or wrongly, that the die is cast in your early days. One of 3 children lived in a very small village in Ceredigion, in Bwlchlan. Family of 3 to a working class family. The strength of that was that it was extremely happy. I had a very, very strong, happy base. Wherever I intended going, and whenever I came back to terra firma. So I was privileged in that sense. Now, in the days of social inclusion, they would tell you that people who have received free school meals are not as likely to succeed. There was a period when I did have free school meals. That was never a hurdle. I actually based that on the fact that the family life was strong. What was important for me, that the unit was a happy one. You could say that also we had both parents believing that children came first within that household. And when you now think of expenditure on matters, we'll say alcohol and other matters, I can always remember, in many ways we were a typical Welsh non-conformist family. There was one day in every year when Dad would go to the pub. This was a big thing, because we wouldn't have our evening meal at 6 o'clock, 6:30, when Dad came home. He'll be very late tonight, because he worked in the milk factory. Very late meant that he'd called in a pub at Felinfach to buy the stout in order for Mum to make the Christmas puddings. So every year, Dad would be an hour late coming home because he would have called in for some stout. So I also see that as actually prioritising their spend. They didn't have a lot of money, but what they did have was prioritised. So that's one thing I will always say, do we put enough emphasis on? And actually, much later, when I worked as a lawyer for Dyfed County Council, I did a lot of social services matters and a lot of care proceedings. And it always worried me. And it always worries me until this day. And our Director of Social Services will tell you, as will the Education Director, I always want to know how good are our children faring if they've been in public care or if they are vulnerable in any way. And I think that's the start for me. Went to a primary school. I think for 2 terms we had 2 teachers. It was a sole teacher from therein on. And I've asked myself many a times whether or not they were role models. Both were head of the households because both in later life became widowed. One was widowed from day one. And interestingly, I couldn't have had a better role model. For those of you who are interested in history, you will have seen John Davis's book, commonly known as John Bullchan. It was John Bullchan's mother that was my head teacher at the primary school. And then we had another person whose husband was extremely ill, and she would have been the sole breadwinner. I don't know whether they became role models. I will never know that. But I do know that they gave their whole time to educating the children they had, and that included what they did in their social life. I'm a very, very poor pianist, all right? I bang the piano, and I rather enjoy doing it. But what is interesting was that Mrs. Davis had decided that all the girls, and it was girls, that all the girls in the school were having piano lessons. We didn't have a piano, so she's very friendly with my mother, says, "Oh, would you like to have our piano? Because there's nobody at home now playing it." Yes, I was very much like the other pupils at that stage. Do we still actually pay that interest to our children who are educated if we think they are slightly different? It wasn't, is she musical? But she would be the same. I know not. But I think it is a question that we should actually ask ourselves. And when we do look at education, I do think there's quite an important role that teachers do play. Pan es i'r ysgol uwchradd, ysgol o ddim yn rhy fawr yn Tregaron, ac os edrychwn ni gyd nôl ar yn cyfle ni o addysg yn ysgolion uwchradd, mae yna rai athrawon yn aros allan. Ac I fi oedd gyda ni athrawes hanes, oedd yn digwydd bod yn bwnc o'n i'n hoffi'n fawr iawn, yn berson arbennig iawn. Mrs Evans oedd hi'n formidable, allai ddim meddwl am well cyfieithad chwaith nag hynna am Mrs Evans. Oedd person cadar yn disgybleth lem, ond hiwmor iach iawn. Erbyn yr ail flynedd o'n i yn yr ysgol uwchradd, oedd hi wedi penderfynu ddylen ni fod yn mynd i'r brifysgol. Ond hefyd yn ymwybodol nag oedd un o'n rhieni wedi bod yn y brifysgol. Felly be nath hi, oedd galw hibo a dechrau sgwrsio a dod a prospectuses prifysgol i'n rhieni pan o'n i yn yr ail flynedd. Nath hi ymddeol pan o'n i yn y bedwaredd. A fe gadwodd i'r diddordeb a fe gadwodd i'r ymweliadau. Ac i fi oedd yna rhywbeth eitha arbennig, o'n i'n hoffi Mrs Evans yn fawr iawn. Es i mewn am wneud y gyfraith, a dwi'n cofio hi'n dweud, wel, byddai hi'n nabod rhywun ei gilydd, sydd ddim defnyddio hynna, herwydd dwi dal ddim yn hoffi wneud hynna. Ond pan ges i'n erthyglau cynta yn Abreiron, ac pan o'n i wedi qualifio, dwi'n dal yn cofio'r galwad ffôn yma yn dod o'r wrth ynghyn athrawes hanes i. A oedd hi mor finiog ac eriod. A dwi'n cofio dweud, Bronwen, mae gyda fi berson yn dod mewn fori, hi bydd nawr eich cleient cyntaf chi. Wedi a nath hi ddweud beth oedd hi, a mae'n mynd i ddod mewn, a mae'n mynd i ofyn amdano chi. A naeth neb ond Miss Morgan y tro iddi. Newch chi'n siŵr bod chi'n mynd i weld eich bos pan yma i wei bod chi'n dod ag arian mewn i'r ffyrm, a gofynnwch chi am ragor o arian diwedd y flwyddyn os ydych chi'n dechrau dod â cleientau mewn. And that was typically Mrs Evans. Sharp, but also cared for her pupils. She made sure that I had a commercial base as well to discuss matters such as my salary at the end of the year. And it was quite right that I was able to see my principal and say, now I'm qualified, you have employed me, but I'm also bringing in business to your firm. I'm not just dealing with other clients. And the other one was my former Welsh teacher, whom I kept in contact with until he died. He thought that the law suited me, but he also kept on giving me Welsh lessons until he died 2 or 3 years ago. So I think I would say that the hurdles that could have come across me, those of lack of confidence or thinking that I wasn't as, definitely not as wealthy as the other children around me, but considered myself fortunate. And I think those early days gave me the base that enabled me to have some confidence in going forward. I will never know, part of the thing that I was also quite a keen Eisteddfod competitor. That's got its advantages, it's got its disadvantages. There are some people who are well suited to do that, but if you do enjoy it, it actually is an evener, provided you compete well or you're able to do whatever you're doing well. The fact that you're male, female, rich, poor, or whoever you are doesn't really matter. And that can give you confidence. It suited me. I'm not saying it suits everybody, but I always had that encouragement. The other thing is whether or not now, looking around us, are we giving the same opportunities to the females that are around us? Sorry, my watch strap has gone, so if you think that I'm going on, give me a nudge or something. I know my own.
You're doing all right.
Okay, if I see somebody sleeping, I'll stop immediately, all right? But are we doing it? Because actually, the way I had articles, right? So your typical working class family, no one had ever used a lawyer. So we were told second year in college, you now call it traineeship or training contracts. Go and look for articles. Okay, so I went home and said, I've got this directory, I've got to start writing to all these firms of solicitors, because there would be nobody who would be able to say, oh, well, I can contact our family lawyer. Mum was collecting for the blind, and the one person she called on was the late Mrs. Creasy. If anybody of you have read John Creasy's novels, crime novels, she would have been John Creasy's first wife. I think he had a few down the line, but she was his first wife. So Mrs. Creasy asks my mother, how the children doing, what's Bronwen doing? I said, oh, she's busily going to write some letters to various firms of solicitors. Oh, tell her to hold off. I'm seeing my solicitor tomorrow. I'll ask him whether or not he's aware of any vacancies anywhere. So then I have a phone call. Oh, Dennis Gwyn Hughes would like you to go down on work experience. So I went there for 2 or 3 weeks. At the end of the period, he says, well, now, you should be finishing university in 12 months' time, or whatever it was. Give me a ring, because you can be articled here. So now I look at the challenges for our young graduates, and I'm able honestly to say that I found my articles without even writing a letter to anyone. No CV, just Mrs. Creasy went to see her family lawyer, and I was invited down to have work experience, and thereafter I was offered. And I honestly feel we owe a debt to young people now that are coming up. Do we help them and give them that leg up in the same way? And that always concerns me, and I do honestly think that we're holding that responsibilities. Coming into public service, I think on selection, I'm very happy because I have not found any hurdles when it comes to selection. The challenge is to get your candidates there to be selected. And it is interesting, Ceredigion, as small as we are, for a month at least, we're going to have heads of paid service, as myself being a female, our political leader is a female, our civic leader, the chairman of council, is also a female. So I don't think there is any other local authority in Wales that will have the, if you like, the trio being females. You may have, no, I don't think you even have two, actually, if I'm correct. I'm looking over towards the presiding officer there, no. I think in the latest 2012 results, there was one female political leader in Wales. I think the best information I have as of now is that we have two female political leaders. I think Cardiff is a female leader and Ceredigion. There may be more, correct me if I'm wrong. So it's getting people to be on that candidate list that we need to ensure. And we need to ensure that also that people have tasters of local government. And it does worry me, quite honestly now, on looking at future workforce as we go into the recession, is whether or not we are able to put hand on heart and tell our young graduates a life in public service will make a difference, and at the same time they feel confident that they're doing what's right for them. And I think we do need to be much more proactive, and I say this as officers in local governments. So I think that is one thing. And despite, and I say that because I'm quite happy on the selection, and I think obviously any selection process I've gone through have been, the appointees have always been predominantly male. If it's full council, I think in all instances that we've been full council, we'll have 2 or 3 females out of the 42. So it is getting people to arrive there. That is the query, because I think I was only, if I refer to our corporate management team containing the chief executive and directors, I was the one female around that table in '96. Whereas we've reduced the number of directorship, I'm still the only female around that table, but it presents about 16%. And when we come down to the layer that's below that, on our what's currently we refer to as our assistant directors, it's about 18%. So I think that's where we need to look at in order to promote flexible working. Fine, we'll assist, but we need to make sure that we're getting them to the position that they're receiving the training and the opportunities that will enable them to sit around. I think it's also important for us to have people to come in on work experience. There is a tendency that people who come in to have work experience, that they will be not with the directors, not with the chief executive, but with other people. I honestly believe that we should give some of our time so that they can share it with us. And I think we do owe them that, because they can see the opportunities from day one. And the fact also, I suspect, I've got to put it on record, I am childless, and as a couple were childless, not of design, so turfing around with family commitments has always been that my husband is very good at most things. He knows that I will turn up when I can, and that's it. So, but he's able to look after himself, so we haven't been in a caring role, which can be a challenge as well. And I think we need to consider that. And I suspect what I would say, we all have an ability to make a difference. And I do think that we've got to concentrate our efforts from the time of childhood into adolescence. When it's meeting the postgraduate period, yes, there is an opportunity. Was it the Jesuits who said, give us the child and we'll give you the man? And I think we need to ensure as well that we now, in our respective roles, when we see the child, male or female, we will give you the future citizens that will ensure that we do live in an equal society. So I hope that's a bit of a help for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bronwyn. And I made a few notes here on some of the topics you've touched on there, in particular the question of role models. You talked earlier about your teachers, and I'm sure many of us can attest to that, and in particular the role that they played in coming from a working class background, as I did myself. In the 60s and 70s, it was a huge opening of if you like, perspectives in terms of going to university, the fact that contraception had been addressed. And we may want to come back to that because it was also around that time that the women's movement was really at its most, if you like, well, at its strongest perhaps. And we were talking earlier as to whether or not that period, the 60s and 70s, and looking around, I think a few of us were probably in our prime at that point. If we're not now. But it was a time when women's issues were very much, suddenly there was a whole women's movement, and we wondered earlier whether or not that's had a bit of a high tide, and that the kind of progress from the efforts of people at that time, whether or not they actually have waned a bit. You also touched on the question of pay levels and the way standing up for yourself actually gets results, so that's probably a lesson to us all as well. And the question of confidence, which has come up before, and the Eisteddfodic tradition that certainly does give Welsh children, I think, a very great advantage in terms of presentational skills, etc. And then you touched on the real issue of opportunities for young people, and I think perhaps that's for all young people, but perhaps more difficult again coming for women, because your final point was really the question of multitasking and women's career patterns, which inevitably take different routes and sometimes different pace to men's because of family commitments. So I'd like to, with that, open it to the floor, if I may. I'm sure all of the stories we've heard today will have prompted lots of thoughts, and I very much welcome your questions or comments. If I could just ask you to identify yourselves if you wish to speak, and I hope there'll be lots of discussion. So where are all those hands? Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Sue Chambers. I'm the Director of HR at Aberystwyth University. So I'm glad to hear we've got an alumni on the panel. That's great. My question is actually picking up on what Bronwyn said about giving young people a leg up, because I absolutely agree with you that is a real issue, I think, for this country. And one of the things that we're looking at is graduate traineeships, apprenticeships, as the university, as an employer. I'm also the HR representative for the universities in Wales on the public sector discussion group that Bernard Galton at the Welsh Assembly Government chairs. And we are very, very keen to try and look at this as a country. What kind of opportunities can we offer young people through apprenticeships and graduate trainee schemes? And I think this group and that discussion, I think, is really worthwhile having. I think there's a lot more we could do in that area if we work collectively on that.
What do you think we could do?
I think lots of people have lots of good ideas about this. And when I say lots of people, it's lots of organisations. The public sector certainly has a lot of ideas. The universities and colleges have a number of ideas about how we could do a much more coordinated approach to this. That's apprenticeships and graduate traineeships. And I think each organisation is trying to do something. The university, for example, we're looking at graduate opportunities at the university as soon as young people graduate. But I think if we collectively could look at this issue, I think we could possibly achieve more than we are doing in isolation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lady there.
Jackie Roberts, Deputy Chief Constable, David Powys Police. Just picking up from your point, actually, we'd be delighted to give you a list of areas that some of your students might be interested in coming to join us and provide us with the benefit of their experience. It's certainly something that we've looked at, and in my former force, it's a position that worked very, very successfully indeed. But I think across public sector Wales, we could actually draw up a list that we could share with universities, colleges and other further education institutes to kind of let students know what is available and what's out there. And as jobs become tighter, the benefits of getting that early work experience to get a foot up the ladder is what we need to really be doing now. And I'd certainly be happy for us to kind of start to lead the way on some of that.
That's what I like. Get women in a room together and things happen. Okay, thank you for that. It's an outcome. Sorry, I think the lady back was...
Margaret Haynes, Tasker Menywod School. Actually, I'm going to take issue with something you said. You said, inevitably, women's career paths will take a different route and at a different pace because of family life. That's a cultural mindset that has to be challenged. Mine didn't. I became a head teacher within 12 years of becoming a teacher because my husband did all the childcare and actually stepped out of the rat race. He's now an LSA because my children are in secondary school. But the cultural perception that it is women whose career will change because they have children has to be challenged, and it has to be challenged by women.
Good point.
It's sometimes what we put as self-imposed, because very often there's also an assumption within a partnership or a marriage that it will be the male that will travel to be promoted. And yeah. Yeah, and
I'm not married. I said, I've got the job, you're a musician, we have children, we look after them.
yes, so that that's reality. But we do have our preconceived ideas on what will happen. I don't know, as you say, well, there are enough questions. The interesting part when you're talking about hurdles, I think one or two. When I say complainants, you are not talking about you're sort of complaining about service who will be tended to be or regular character bashing. I do suspect that some of those will treat male and females differently. And I think if you're looking at what I've seen, yes, there is a difference there, and had less of it now, even though one or two are still doing it. They will always think that they've hit the jackpot by the fact that they've become aware of the fact that I never changed my surname when I got married. Fine, no issue for me. Fine, no issue for me. But it's quite interesting and intriguing the way that some people will use that on top of some other things, of finding personal information, which I don't think they would do if you're dealing with a male. So that is not a hurdle to be promoted or a hurdle in a career, but something you've got to be more than aware to be ready for.
Thank you.
I just wondered what the panel's view is. We've talked a lot about role models, and I wondered what the panel's view would be on the sort of popular culture, the Cheryl Cole role model to younger women. And I have a daughter who's 13, and I'm quite concerned about the way popular culture portrays women in the sort of red top tabloids. I just wondered what the opinion
Don't get me started.
I just wondered what the opinion of the panel would be. And
This might be a question for Holly.
For me, I think just generally as a society, newspapers reflect society. If we aren't giving our readers what they want to read and what they want to look at, they're not going to buy the papers and they're not going to get them. So I think the bigger issue is actually the people who are buying the newspapers and reading the newspapers. You know, you wouldn't have things like Page 3 if people didn't buy the newspapers, if people didn't view it as acceptable. I mean, I don't actually mind Page 3. You know, those women that are appearing on there are actually making a lot of money out of it. And it just depends on your attitude and how you're sort of approaching what's there. I mean, obviously, famously, when Rebecca Brooks became editor of The Sun, Page 3 girl on that day was called Rebecca with the same spelling, you know. So it's difficult. I mean, I don't necessarily think that pop stars... I go to so many schools and do talks in schools where they all want to be famous. They all think it's a quick thing. They just have to go on the television programme and suddenly they forget that whatever industry you're in, there's a lot of hard work that goes behind it. And actually, the people who succeed are the ones who succeed on merit and skill. And it doesn't matter what walk of life that you go into, that's actually the case. And I think we need to perhaps be drumming that into people in some way. And the way you can do that is you counteract and you know, the role models that are out there, the public, you know, the people who are appearing in these publications. And we have to show them, you know, that we have got key women in key roles, people, you know, women making key decisions. And, you know, as a local newspaper, we reflect what everybody in our community is doing, whether they're young people, old people, men, women. But if we don't know about it, we can't report on it. So I think there's a responsibility for everybody to get involved. And also, you know, just raising children in our schools to say, yes, well, if you do want to do something, go and do it. We take young people for work experience. They have to be over 16 because of the environment we work in. We can't spend the time mollycoddling people and looking after them. But I'm very proud that in the years I've been doing it, I've inspired a lot of young women to actually, well, and men, but particularly women, to go into and think, yes, they can be a journalist. I had one girl who had been told by us at school because she was dyslexic, she couldn't be a journalist. Well, that's absolute nonsense. And, you know, she came and spent a few months with us, okay, mostly unpaid, but she realised after that, you know, she was brilliant. She could get the story, she could talk to people, she could bring the information, a few spelling mistakes, as long as she put the spell check through it and somebody else checked it, which always happens in the newspaper anyway. If we make some allowances for that, she's got a very good career ahead of her. She went off to do a journalism course, and she could work really well. She'd be better perhaps on the nationals where she's only focusing on one story at a time or whatever, but that's not just the fact that she was dyslexic, that was just she was that type of person. Whereas, you know, we need a whole mix of people in journalism, and, you know, just because you're female, just because you're dyslexic, doesn't mean you can't be a journalist. I've had another young girl who, we were covering a maternity position, and where normally we'd try and get somebody who's qualified, but in Pembrokeshire we're so far away from where everybody is, it's very difficult to get people for a short contract, just because of the costs involved in moving and living places. We had a girl who came on work experience who was really, really good. She was off to university to do a journalism course after the summer, so we said, well, look, we'll take you on for the summer. We will pay you, it won't be a lot. We'll pay you for the summer. She's now gone on. She's just got onto the Daily Mail training programme. So, and that's all because she came to us. Interestingly, she was actually a law graduate as well. But, you know, these things can happen, and we're very proud that we do give young people the opportunity to come in and see us. I got my job through work experience. I walked in one day. I did have to write a letter, though, but I wrote a letter, and they got back to me about 9 months later, so I'd given up hope, but it happened. I stayed a week. They said, oh, come back next week, so I came back next week, and then it was like, well, do you want to stay the summer? They paid me £100 a week for the summer, and then it was like, oh, I suppose we ought to train you then, and I sort of fell into it. I'm not even conscious that I had an interview, it just sort of happened. So without that, I had no knowledge, I didn't know anybody in journalism, I didn't know how to become a journalist. So I'm very conscious of the importance that work experience does play. And also, in a job like journalism, we like people, everybody coming out of university with journalism courses, there's so many journalism media courses, they've all got the same qualifications, they've all got A's, strings of A's, all sorts of stuff. We're looking for characteristics in those people that are going to make them good journalists. And very often, an interview, half-hour interview, you might know straight away, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be really good at the job. And work experience is a very good way for us to see what people are like. And newspapers, you like people with local knowledge. I'm very lucky on the Western Telegraph that of the 15 journalists I've got in the newsroom, people in the newsroom, only 3 of us aren't Pembrokeshire born and bred. That just doesn't happen in other areas. But it just, the contacts, we've been growing our own talent in Pembrokeshire, and it's working.
Thanks very much.
Sorry, I think it's an interesting question you asked. Sorry, I'm
Sorry,
thinking about
there's
the
a
role
lady been
model.
waiting
Sorry.
to speak at the back.
Spotting the talent early and putting some measures in place to actually push people through. And the issue that you all raised about confidence is sometimes women hold themselves back a few years instead of actually going for it when they are probably ready for it. And part of that is a responsibility on organisations identifying those early doors and giving them the opportunities. That's not an unfair advantage against men, but it's giving them the stuff that sometimes they've not been able to access because of the balance in the organisation, and their networks are not as broad as those of their male colleagues that they might be competing against. So I think that that's where the issue is for us. I mean, we've recently introduced some mentoring, and in fact, Carmarthenshire County Council are going to hook up with our mentoring scheme within Bywyd Police. And again, maybe there's some more mileage in spreading that more widely across public sector as well. Because I think that's the route into it, and giving people different experiences. So actually when they come to the table competing against their male colleagues, they've got something more to say.
So getting it embedded in the organisation and part of the thinking of the organisation.
Yeah, we could call it actually the workforce planning. That's what it boils down to. It's getting people around the selection table. And I totally agree with you. I don't think anybody wants to see anything that's gives that preference, but what we do need as responsible employers is called workforce planning, and there's no advantage there. You're actually working for the betterment of your organisation, and I suspect what I would crudely term as getting the candidates around the selection table, and I think that's where the challenge lies. It's not saying that we should move from the current 16% to 40% next time there's a selection round. It is actually ensuring that we are either growing our own or able within the public service to get people that can sit around those tables, and that it's not actually pure chance that that people have been spotted somewhere because there's a manager that's innovative and forward thinking that will have pushed an individual much to that person's gain, but that it becomes the way of thinking.
Delith Humphreys, Chair of Dyfed Powys Police Authority. Melinda mentioned the number of people on the Pembrokeshire National Park. It's the same with us. We have 19 members, 10 are local authority members and 9 are independents. Now, of the 10 local authority members, in the past, and I've been a member for 13 years as an independent, we've only had one local authority member who was a female. Sorry, 2. One of them is Joyce Watson across the table before she was an AM. I think there is a big, big problem in that local authority members are mostly men. And therefore, when they are appointed onto public bodies, it's going to be the men that are going to be appointed. And I think that's a very, very big issue.
This sort of touches on a wider point about chicken and egg, isn't it? Yes. I mean, it's about experience and networks, and you find once you've done a couple of things, then it makes you eminently qualified to do more. And there is that problem for a lot of women who perhaps, haven't had as much experience and then don't put themselves forward, going back to some points we've said earlier. But why do you think women don't stand for councils? Sorry, Delith. I have no idea. Because that's part of the problem, isn't it? I mean, not enough candidates, so proportionately, you don't get enough elected members. Joyce?
I'm going to be completely controversial, but then anyone that knows me knows I will be. I was with Delith, and one of the questions that we continually ask, because you talked about workplace planning, the question I asked the then Chief Constable every single meeting that we had in Dyfed Powys Police was how many females he had within his force of sergeant or above. And the answer was the same every month, of course, because it never changed. For a long time, that is. And that was 0. And then I unpicked that and asked why that was. And the answer was because they didn't get through the training. Okay. So why didn't they get through the training? Because an element of the training required them to handle firearms. And the firearms that they were handling were too big for the female officers' hands. You know, so when we talk about to quote or not to quote, and I would quote her, by the way, but then I'm a Labour Party member, we have to start to get to the root causes. And the root causes very often, and this is about public appointments, is the value that goes alongside the criteria. So let's start with the criteria about what you need to bring to the table in the first place, and secondly, how it's then evaluated in terms of what people who are doing the evaluating consider the right criteria. And when we start at the beginning and get the forms right, and the people they're evaluating what really matters in your public appointment, and they don't disparage what is mostly women's experience against what is predominantly male experience. So if you've managed to run a household with 8 children and you've managed your budgets very well, against being a single male employer who's run his budget along equal lines, but of course his experience is greater than yours, that's where things go wrong. And if we do one single thing, I think, in taking these things forward, it is looking at that. Because unless you get your foundation right in the first place, and then truly value people, nothing, absolutely nothing is going to change for women.
Well, thank you very much. The clock is working against us, and I know that Rosemary has to go on to another appointment, so I'm going to invite her to say a few words to conclude this session, but I'm sure there'll be informal discussion after this. So thank you.
It's a case of follow that then. I found this session absolutely fascinating. I think the contributions from our panel have been exceptional, and of course you've chaired this in an exemplary way, so thank you very much indeed. I think a lot has come out from today. I think there's already been some contact made about, you know, mentoring schemes and about the information we had there that is already available. But what I found interesting was listening to Holly, because Holly is standing where she is because she's standing on the shoulders of generations of women that have been before. And it's wonderful to hear that someone like Holly has never experienced any discrimination or any difficulties in getting where she's got. And I think that's great for you. It's wonderful to hear, but it isn't, you know, it's not by chance that has happened. It's sort of generations of women trying to make a real difference. And there's been I had a speech, but I'm not going to do the speech. I'm going to do this. I think the major issue we're talking about here is confidence. And women are not as confident as men. The women here in this room are probably extremely confident, but you're not the average woman on the street. And I found over the years, when you're interviewing for jobs, you'll get women will apply for some jobs, but men will apply for a job they can do 50% of. But a woman will only apply for a job she can do at least 90% of. And that just shows you that the difference is, you know, and I'm not talking about graduates and the people who've actually made it. I'm talking about the average woman. And what we have to try and decide is, where should we be putting our efforts now? Should we be looking at the graduates who are really going to run the country in the future? Should we be looking at the next layer down? Should we be looking at the women who are having children at 16 and end up as single parents? Or should we be concentrating on the early years, which I think is quite exceptional. But I think Bronwyn's, did she have any role models? I think the strong Welsh woman has obviously been a great influence in Bronwyn's life. And if we all had a Mrs. Creasy round the corner, that would be very, very helpful. And I thought Melinda's description of the value that she can put into a national body and the enjoyment you're getting out of it is fantastic. But people are saying, well, why are we not getting women coming forward? It's the confidence. Why are we not getting more women in local government? Don't film this bit. But the reason we're not getting in local government is not the glass ceiling or the sticky floor. It's that thick layer of men in the middle. And trying to get through that layer is quite difficult. I've had experiences where I've this morning, to be honest, I've been really challenged. I've been to see the Gypsy school project here in Pembrokeshire, and it's quite exceptional to see these young children who've come from a very different lifestyle, and they're now holding down jobs, and they realise education is the way forward. Now, if we can only get that to all young girls, and particularly schools, have to make sure the girls are not said, well, you should become a hairdresser or a beautician. You should become a plumber. You should become... And I do lots of conferences where I'm trying to get women into industry or into construction. And I always say, you go where the boys are, because the boys are where the money is. Because, you know, it's the male jobs always get more money. And I just find it quite... this morning was really quite emotional for me. I'm going to have to come to terms with what I've actually seen. So I would like to thank you very much. And those who haven't been to see the Priory project, you really should go. And I think Pembrokeshire County Council should be very proud of what they're doing. It's really quite an exceptional thing. There are lots of things that we have to assimilate from today. But I think the thing that's come across is that we must never pull the ladder up behind us. You're all women who've achieved in your own way. Some exceptionally, you know, some would think they're run-of-the-mill. But actually, if you become a county councillor, or you become, you know, a senior official, or assistant chief constable, you are really an exceptional women. And what we have to remember in Wales is that it's a very male-dominated society. I always say, once you accept that God made Saturday for rugby, then you'll understand the kind of, you know, things we live with in Wales. But the National Assembly for Wales was the first legislature in the world to get 50% women, to have equal parity. Now, that is really quite exceptional. We've slipped back. We're down to about 43%, but we're still very high on that scale. And it's because some parties had, you know, positive action. And I think it's important that we have positive action, but not as a formal thing, but all of you going out there, making sure you don't pull the ladder up behind you, you hold your hand out to another sister who needs help. Now, whether it's someone around the corner who hasn't got a grandmother, who, you know, can go and babysit for them, a whole range of things, as simple as that. But education is the way forward. I think it's really important that we do get women who will be like Holly in the future. They don't have any issues. But you have to feel passionate about something to move forward. And I think my little story of how I got into local government is that I had 2 small children. I used to take them to the park, and I'd be fed up of standing up because there was no bench to sit on. Now, I tried desperately to get a bench from the all-male council. I didn't get one. So when the election came, I decided I would stand, but not just want better education and better this, but I wanted a bench. And the idea was that I'd embarrass these guys into giving us a bench. But of course, what happened? I won. Because the women got behind me and I won. I got my bench within 4 weeks. So it just shows you have to be careful what you wish for, because you could end up as a presiding officer. But I would like to say thank you very much. I'd like to thank our translators and our team for actually organising this event. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. And I hope that something will come from this from our national conference in the autumn. And I hope you're all able to attend. So I'm sorry I've got to go, but I'm going now to Pembroke College to visit some more fantastic young people in the area and just show them that really they are the future of Wales. I hate to say it, girls, but we're the past, you know. It's the future that's coming. So diolch yn fawr, and thank you very much indeed.
Cynulliad Cenedlaethol Cymru yw'r corff sy'n cael ei ethol yn ddemocrataidd i gynrychioli buddiannau Cymru a'i phobl, i ddeddfu ar gyfer Cymru ac i ddwyn Llywodraeth Cymru i gyfrif. I gael rhagor o wybodaeth ac i ganfod pwy sydd yn eich cynrychioli, ewch i cynulliadcymru.org neu gallwch chi'n dilyn ar Facebook a Twitter. The National Assembly for Wales is the democratically elected body that represents the interests of Wales and its people, makes laws for Wales, and holds the Welsh Government to account. For more information and to find out who represents you, go to assemblywales.org or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.